As you may have noticed, we're in the middle of a federal election in Canada. Firearms are a polarising issue, and historically, results of federal elections have had a major influence on the experience of gun owners. As a retailer in the firearms industry, I've had lots of discussions with my customers regarding political directions. While many Canadian gun owners feel that the Conservatives are the only way to vote, others are after change and question whether the alternatives are really that bad. I'm Kate from AmmoSupply, and with me today is Edward from TV Presspass to take a closer look at the major parties and their platforms.
Thanks. Before we get started here, I really want to emphasize elections are won by the voters who show up. So on October 19th, make sure that you get out to your local polling place and cast your vote, no matter who it's for. That's what matters.
So where do the political parties officially stand on firearms in this election?
Well, when we're looking at the officially published policy, there's a little bit from each of the parties, and specifically in regards to this election. So the NDP have published their full policy document, and they're a party that gun owners in the past have been pretty cautious about. But in this election, there is one mention of firearms in their entire policy document, and it's specifically in reference to gang violence and policing. So they address border issues, and they want a police task force specifically to address urban city violence. And other than that, there's nothing in there. So they don't mention a registry, they don't mention classification, which is significant. It's something that has usually been a hot button issue for them, and they're moving away from it, which I hope means that they might acknowledge that firearms might not be an election issue.
And how about the Liberals?
The Liberals, on the other hand, have caused a lot of uproar. So they published an official document, and there's been a lot of analysis on this already. But essentially, they want to step back, and they want to step back from Bill C-42 that was passed in June this year. But their document is also a little bit fuzzy in the way that they want to establish things that are already in place. So in their document, they specifically refer to confirmation of PAL information, right? So they want to make sure that when you sell a firearm to somebody else, you have to verify that person's possession and acquisition license. The problem is that we already do that. That already is on the books. In the same way, they want to enhance background checks. And it's just not really clear what that means. So it doesn't look very good. It doesn't look very good for firearms owners, and it doesn't present that they have a really good knowledge of the existing legislation now.
How do you enhance daily background checks?
Well, that's exactly it, right? It's already on the books. So it's a very odd piece that they're proposing.
And how about the Conservatives?
Well, the Conservatives haven't done a whole lot in this particular election, and mostly that's because they've had 10 years in power to establish what they want to do as far as firearms go. The only specific things that I could find as far as their platform for this election is that we'd see the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee able to make recommendations to the Governor and Council. And that was part of C-42 that would essentially allow the government to establish the classification of a firearm when it's imported.
So that's more a move away from the RCMP?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's specifically trying to remove some of the RCMP's influence on the firearms reference table. The other thing that the Conservatives are proposing if they win a government, which isn't very specific to me as an individual, but kind of interesting and firearms related, is the Canadian Rangers. So the Canadian Rangers have used the same firearm, the Lee Enfield, for 70 years now, since World War II. And they're replacing it. So they're getting a new rifle made by Colt Canada that's coming out in the next year or so. The original Lee Enfields, the Conservative government would like to give them to the Rangers who have been carrying them for as long as they've been in that service. So I think that's sort of a nice nod to the people who have been using the firearms to let them take them home.
Okay, so that's the official. What about the unofficial views of the parties?
Well, so the party leaders, they all have sort of off-the-cuff comments. And some of them are really interesting. The problem with off-the-cuff, of course, is that there's no election promise associated with it. There's no legislative backing, so they can say things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to commit to. So Prime Minister Stephen Harper actually said some really positive things for gun owners. In March 12th of this year, he was in Saskatoon and was speaking specifically about rural Canadians using firearms for security and personal security, which is a big thing for a Prime Minister to say. in the past that hasn't, I mean, that's not even listed as a legitimate reason to get your restricted license, right? If I ask for defensive use, that's not okay. So it was really encouraging to see that kind of perspective brought forward by the Prime Minister. But of course, it doesn't necessarily reflect a real policy. So it's interesting, but it doesn't have the amount of weight that I would like it to have. Similarly, Justin Trudeau, because his party does have a really firm, hard line around their policy document, he voted against C-42 in November 26th of last year, 2014. And when he did that, he also made a number of public comments that really sort of mischaracterized what C-42 was about. So he was saying to the public that he was concerned that this was going to allow handguns and assault rifles to be stored in vehicles outside of hockey rinks, which is unfortunate because it has a really negative air to it. And it's also not what that bill was about and not how that bill works. So the ATTs were not removed. They're just no longer a printed document. Now they're a document that's attached to a license. All the conditions and terms are still in effect. So that's sort of an unfortunate, off-the-cuff kind of remark from him. Thomas Mulcair made some interesting statements also last year in December. He raised the possibility of the NDP bringing back a long gun registry of some kind. And specifically, he said he wanted to see police forces able to track every long gun in Canada. But he also tried to back off from it a little bit because he didn't want to see a resurrection of our long gun registry that we got rid of in 2012. He didn't want to see that come back, but he wasn't quite clear on what he would see instead. So I found that to be a really interesting remark to make, and specifically there's been no policy to back that up, and no official memos stating the NDP position or anything like that, but it is something he was saying quite recently.
Some gun owners are ambivalent about the existence of a gun registry. Why is it such a hot button topic for some people?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons that the long gun registry represents a real issue to us. And the big one is that it's a step backwards, right? This is something that Canada's done already, experimented with, and then repealed in 2012. So the idea that we would have a new form of long gun registry, it's kind of a tough pill to swallow. And it's a really hard sell as far as what the benefits are going to be or how it would be different from the existing one, because the original long gun registry was very expensive and was generally regarded as ineffective, right? It's not something that police forces used an awful lot of. The other issue, of course, with our registry is that it represents a real data security issue, that in the modern era where you've got lots of people able to access lots of data that used to be regarded as generally secure, the idea of gathering names and addresses and firearms information and collating those together, that presents a real security risk to the individuals who own those things.
And I think we saw that in the last registry for sure. And I suppose another question is, where do a lot of the guns involved in crimes originate from? Yeah,
so when we're talking about the usefulness to police officers when it comes to a long gun registry, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, the vast majority of the firearms that are used in crime in Canada are either smuggled from the United States or stolen. And I don't want to go too heavily into the United States side of things, but those sorts of firearms are not going to be covered or addressed under a registry.
As we know, actions speak louder than words, especially when it comes to politicians. Historically, what have the Liberals and Conservatives accomplished while in power that could speak to their possible future intentions?
Yeah, well, I don't want to go too deep into the historical side of things because there is a very long history and a lot of complicated stuff that has happened in Canadian firearms law. But speaking roughly, under Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, back in 1991, we had Bill C-17 come in. And that was essentially what established the FAC, or your Firearms Acquisition Certificate. So that was sort of the beginning of the licensing program we see today. The more advanced one was Bill C-68, which is often the one that most Canadian gun owners have issues with. And that was introduced under Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in 1995. And that's what established the registry itself and the Canadian Firearms Program as we know it now.
How about the NDP?
So because the NDP have never had a federal government, there isn't a lot of historical precedents for them. We haven't seen them. This is the first time that they've had an election where they could possibly win and form a government. But we do have comments from their justice critic, whose name I'm probably going to butcher, François Boivin. And she's out of Gatineau and has published several articles in the past 4 years emphasizing specifically the NDP's criticism of the Conservative Party around the UN Arms Control Treaty and around border security and firearms smuggling. And they've also supported Quebec's efforts to construct their own provincial registry, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise because the NDP really rely on Quebec for their electability.
How about the Greens and the Libertarians?
So some of the more niche or off-wing parties, they have some surprisingly good firearms policies. So the Greens, which are traditionally a very heavy left party, and have gone on record in the past of saying things like they would ban handguns or give municipalities the ability to establish their own gun control rules. The most recent thing that I've seen from the Green Party was in direct reference to C-42, and they were describing the Canadian firearms program as lacking transparency and unnecessarily complicated, and were saying that citizens who own firearms should be free from the threat of criminalization. So I think it's important to notice that parties do evolve. Their platforms change, their opinions change, and the most current opinion that we can find from the Green Party seems to be fairly reasonably pro-gun. When it comes to libertarians, they are very heavily courting all kinds of heavy right-wing opinions. So they would like to remove as many prohibitions and legislative obstacles from gun licensing as possible. They want to see guns listed as tools rather than as weapons, that kind of thing. It's quite aggressive. And even though I don't think that we'll see either of these parties form a government anytime soon, I think it is important that they are out there and representing other viewpoints on this issue.
And perhaps they're a viable protest vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good to have something else other than your big three.
Thanks, Edward. I think that's given us a really good basic understanding of the issues at hand.
My pleasure.
And I'm sure that there are a lot of issues we've missed. We encourage you to express your opinions below. And perhaps, Edward, you could keep us posted with any developments out there during the next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you get anything from your local representative or that kind of thing, or if you find documents hidden that we've missed, I want to hear about it, because there is a lot out there on this issue, but it's not a core, it's not a daily news cycle kind of issue in the way that some other things are this election. Other than that, I think it's important, again, go out and vote.
Yeah, get out and vote.